Welcome, everyone, to the Pick Six podcast, where we discuss the biggest stories in college football. I'm your host, Chris Chang, and joining me as always is my co-host, Rudy Tamarchio. Today, we're going to be talking all about the death of spring football, as well as the overlords of college football, meeting about changes to the landscape of college football. But first, we must discuss some matters closer to home. Rudy, it looks like players aren't the only thing Mario Cristobal is willing to poach from rival Florida. Coaches are in the mix as well. Will Harris has been added. The Avengers are assembling on our side. What is going on?
And also, the rumor's been debunked now that, I think UF fans were a little sour saying, hey, well, he's actually going to the NFL. So good luck with that. Looks like he's staying at Miami. The grapes are as sour as ever up in Gainesville.
You know,
So, yeah,
denial is not just a river in Africa. You know that, right?
it's a stinky cologne. Well, so is flattery, but at the same time, yeah, it's good to have some, fresh blood in our defense. There's rumors that you've been hearing about, like how he even like takes hits from guys in full pads. Look, I don't know how
Yeah.
much that helps your coaching, but in terms of meeting eh, becoming like more of gelling as a unit with your defensive coaching staff, it sounds like a guy that's right up Heatherman's uh, you know, alley in terms of intensity and bringing in a good discipline game plan and aggression. So I'm all for it. I don't want to get too high on coaches in the offseason since we have an undefeated record in the offseason the past few years and coaching staffs. But
Yeah, I
as
know.
long as it translates over to product on the field improvement, look, there's not much there's a lot of room to work with. There's not a lot of expectation in terms of what a 1 year turnaround looks like with the defensive unit.
Yeah, so Will Harris, he's kind of the final piece in the puzzle for Mario Cristobal and his staff. He was the last kind of coach we were kind of looking at. He was a secondary coach at UF for one season. Just a little bit about him. Before that, he spent 1 year as a defensive coordinator at Georgia Southern, 4 seasons as a DB coach at Washington. He kind of comes from the muck, as they like to say, in the world. He rose through the ranks. Before that, he was at a bunch of places no one's ever heard of. But the former Los Angeles Chargers assistant helped lead a late season turnaround for the Gator secondary, which saw improvements in almost every statistical category, which was great. Under Harris's leadership, the Florida secondary improved from 3 interceptions in 2023 to 14 in 2024, and an 8.5 yards per attempt in 2023 to 7.3 in 2024. So you're seeing all these trends. They jump from 87th nationally in passing yards per game to number 83. So he clearly has an impact. My question, Rudy, is how will this work with the other new hire that we just had a few weeks ago with Zach Etheridge, both of them being a DB's coach? Are they going to take the secondary with in terms of cornerbacks and safeties and kind of lump them together? Are they going to kind of like as they go figure out who's going to take safeties and who's going to take cornerbacks, or where do you think this is going to impact?
Look, I kind of see this as that should be a warning sign too of this was definitely a weakness in the unit. It's not just what we saw on the field; it's also kind of what they've recognized in the what they would call the front office kind of atmosphere of a
Yeah.
coaching staff. So whether they break it down by defense, like cornerbacks and safeties, or if they want to break it down where one guy's more of a form coach and the other guy's more of an X's and O's and concept guy, I frankly don't care as long as things get fixed because
Absolutely.
it was an issue across the board where communication was one part, but it was also form, it was also angles, it was a lot of things that really plagued that secondary. So however they see fit, when it comes to coaches, as long as the unit is working properly, I don't really care about the style. I think we have bigger issues when it comes to coaches and how they fit into a system. If it's somebody that's new coming into something that's already established and successful, like I think when Al Golden came to Miami, and the big premise was he needs to fix the offense that's been terrible. And then you
Right.
started seeing like, oh, Miami switching to a 3-4 front and they're doing this read and react, crap. I think that was kind of a big warning sign. Like, why mess with what's working
Yeah.
versus this secondary and this defensive unit was in shambles last year. So whatever they need to do to fix it, please be my guest. And also, I want to shout out real quick. I want to shout out. You mentioned Georgia Southern on that coaching pedigree for Will
Hmm.
Harris. Uh, Former Sebastian the Ibis and now current athletic director at Georgia Southern, Chris Davis,
Let's
is
go.
there and he's doing wonderful things. He was in their like front office already as like their chief operating officer, like head of football operations, all that kind of stuff. And now he's got the main job. He kind of broke that news towards the end of 2024. So nice to have a former mascot at the top of an athletic department somewhere.
Like we always say in news, there's always a South Florida connection, and in sports, there's always a Canes connection. What sort of boost do you think this will have on recruiting? Because we did see Jalen Waters shortly after Harris came to Miami decommit from Florida. The standout cornerback has been playing musical chairs with all the Florida schools. What sort of boost do you think this will have on recruiting?
It's definitely going to mean anybody that Will Harris had a great relationship with on the recruiting trail is likely going to want to come to Miami after that. If there's also any existing UF talent, he's only been there a year, so I don't think there's a whole lot of inroads he might have made with people there. But look, anytime you have a great relationship with a prospect, that obviously means a lot, especially in this day and age in college football where coaches, head coaches, position coaches all move around so much. And also, hey, other players move around. Like you look at
Yeah.
what that secondary looks like personnel wise. Look at all the new additions that Miami made, both through the transfer portal and also from recruiting. So yeah, it means a lot to have a position coach that you like.
Yeah, just some of the names that like stuck out to me. Dallas Wilson this past year, Hilton Stubbs, who I think was originally committed to Miami and then flipped back to Florida, and then Ben Hanks Jr. All three studs, all 4 stars that committed to UF under Harris's tutelage. I think it's going to be a great. I mean, we've talked about this ad nauseum on the show. It's not just about coaching; it's about recruitment. It's who do you. It's not just who's coaching you, but it's like, or what you're bringing in, but how that coach impacts recruiting because kids are going to follow certain coaches. You know what I mean? Like you see that up in Ohio State. I think we can get that maybe down here in on the defense. It'd be really nice to see, that recruiting on the defensive side kind of go up, especially in the secondary, because I think that's a position we've kind of been lacking in the last 2 or 3 years, especially since Mario's taken the reins of the program. We haven't seen really a lot of 4 or 5 star blue chippers, want to commit to UM, and hopefully Jalen Waters will be the first of many that will start swinging over. And I think maybe after the spring game, which we'll talk about spring games later, we'll see a few more transfers. Last on this subject, how does this impact the rivalry with Florida? Do you think this is kind of just a strict business decision, a strict business situation, or do you think there's a little bit of bad blood between Gainesville and Coral Gables?
I think it's another chapter in what is a long-standing rivalry that some fans like to think is not a rivalry. But look, we want to go back to why they don't play as often as they do is because it was such a heated rivalry back in the day. So I would say that yes, it's another chapter, yes, but it's another one of those kind of shots across the bow. Because
Right.
what Miami did up in Gainesville last year was one, obviously delightful to see on our end, but two was a real big wake up call for that entire program. They
Oh
can
yeah.
either take that and run with it and see if they have any momentum going into 2025 in terms of how they finished their last season, or it could just be history repeating itself again down in Miami if they get their teeth kicked in again. So I think we'll know more based on what this UF season looks like. Because could it be bad blood between Harris and like the defensive coordinator? Possibly. Could it also be the handwriting on the wall for Billy Napier and that
That's
entire,
where I was going to go next.
organization?
I was going to
Sure.
actually ask you that question. I was like, I start to wonder. Billy was gaining a lot of momentum, a lot of steam towards the end of that year. What would drive one of his stronger coaches, one of his more valuable recruiters to jump ship? You know what I mean? Like I'm not sure if it's a straight, like I said, business decision, or if this is kind of like you were saying, is this the writing on the wall? Is Billy in trouble?
Yeah. Yeah. I
I,
mean,
I,
that's what
I
we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, we're gonna see. I think though I do think I will give Florida this. I think they'll take that steam from the end of last year, bring it into this next year. Don't think they'll beat us, but I think it'll be closer than what the experts think and what happened last year. But trouble with tampering is giving way to a new springtime tradition. It looks like a bunch of schools in the Big Ten and one in the SEC are canceling their spring games. The USC Trojans, Texas, and Ohio State have canceled their spring games, along with the University of Nebraska. Um, is this a good thing or a bad thing, Rudy, for college football?
So this is kind of a tough topic, right? Because
Hmm.
like spring games, depending on where you are, had more meaning than others. The
Right.
fact that like the transfer window is different now to be like you don't want your talent to either run too early because they don't make a depth chart after a spring game, or give away too much. I mean, it's always been kind of like this. It's been this kind of like closed thing where you don't ever have too many expectations. It's just an exhibition to give your fans something to talk about and hopeful for. And also sometimes it's a season ticket play
Yeah.
in certain environments. Like think about Miami. Let's use Miami for example.
Mhm.
They're holding their spring game on campus at Cobb
Right.
Stadium, which is where the soccer team plays, and it's where the track is for those of us Miami fans know, but they may not know the name Cobb Stadium because some
Right.
people are just straight football guys. It's not exactly a season ticket play. Miami can't play it at Hard Rock Stadium because they're currently constructing the stadium court for the Miami Open tennis tournament. That's
Right.
happening right now, and it's going to be up all the way through that tournament, which happens in April. Then they're going to tear it down very quickly and have it set up with paddock for Formula One in May. So Miami can't do the same thing that other schools do in terms of having a stadium to use for the spring games. They can't go up to what used to be Lockhart Stadium, which is now Drive Pink, because Lionel Messi and them have a very nice pitch and they need to use that for their soccer games. And they're no longer beholden to Miami. So look, if I'm Miami, I'd cancel the spring game.
Yeah.
I've got nothing to look forward to. Like Carson Beck's not going to be throwing in it. So you're not really showing anybody anything that's going on. You've raised your ticket prices, season tickets by 30%. So you're going to have a bunch of pissed off people in one very, very small set of grandstands. So from there, I would cancel it. But if you're USC or Ohio State, like I just feel like they're overthinking this. Like there's no need for them to cancel their games because they own their stadiums. They can do whatever they want. In Ohio State, they're taking a victory lap right now. They're the national champ. So why not
Yep.
do something on your own campus? I mean, let's go back to some story time of like really cool, compelling moments that you don't need to have the spring game in the format that it is. You can change it and make it something. You can make it whatever you want because there's a really
Right.
cool clip of it was JT Barrett and Cardale Jones, who were both, at Ohio State. This was 2014, 2015, whenever they had won that first college football playoff national championship. And they had this shot of like, oh, let's see who could throw the ball farther. And they showed JT Barrett, who was the starter for the entirety of that year. But like, he's in the end zone and he takes like a 5-yard run and just launches this ball. It goes past the 50. You're like, all right, that's cool. Cardale Jones grabs a ball. He doesn't even take a step and he throws it like 70 yards and, emasculates JT Barrett, who had the starting job anyway for that year. So like there's other stuff you can do and get people talking. You don't need to
Could you
like
imagine the
put
portal that
guys in
existed then?
pads.
Could you imagine the
Sorry.
portal existed? Could you imagine if the portal existed then?
I mean, look at some of those quarterback rooms, right?
I
Like
know.
that was the one that also had like Braxton Miller for a year. And then if you
Yep.
looked at like Alabama's quarterback room between all the guys that they had and like Quinn Ewers, who was somewhere else too, like yeah, if it existed back then, it would have been wild.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think this is actually a good thing. I think, spring games, I mean, other than like diehard fans and I guess areas that don't have much to do during this time of the year, it's beneficial for those, to kind of bring everyone back together. We got through the winter, now we're in the spring, get excited for the fall ahead. But I think for the programs that are ultra competitive, that are in the hunt for the CFP, I just don't see a benefit in holding it, like, or even in the sense of like making it this event, you know what I mean? Because how much money could you possibly make on top of possibly injuring a player or a player like getting an opportunity to go somewhere else? How do you think this will impact the transfer portal and tampering moving forward?
Uh, I feel like these teams. It's all depending on how they establish their depth charts, right? Like it's one of those things where I don't think you learn much from that. I think it's more dangerous when you go into like the late fall practices where they have like that window that goes up until what, like August, something like that. Or even
Mhm.
like if you announce your roster too early and then they immediately declare for the transfer portal in the middle of the season and say, "Cool, I'm sitting out my eligibility." I don't think the spring does too much to that. Like I just don't see where the competition is just starting at that point. And some of these guys that come in, they're not quite in playing shape yet. So I don't see that as being a real determining factor. I think the guys who are leaving in the spring, like they already had their minds made up. Maybe they use the spring game as kind of like an excuse, but to be honest with you, I think if they held it, it's not going to change anything the way that the rules are currently set.
So do you think this is just something that's happening with these individual schools, or is this a trend that other schools are going to pick up? And if so, who do you think is next?
I mean, it's like the NFL, right? It's a copycat league. So it's one of those where Will it affect other schools doing it? Absolutely, because everyone thinks that somebody has some secret sauce and they say, like, oh, well, let's say those teams that are canceling the spring games between USC, Ohio State. If USC turns around next year and ends up like contending for the Big 10 championship, I don't see it happening. But if they do, I'm sure you'd see another team, another school start doing that. Like UCLA will probably cancel the spring game if that ends up being a fruitful endeavor. So, yeah, I see it. I see it happening a lot more, especially because you're talking about one of the larger conferences in college football, and whatever they
Right.
do ends up trickling down to everybody else. It's a matter of just how creative people get, and as we know in college football, there's not many programs that get creative. So,
Yeah.
what are they going to do instead?
I was actually very surprised that Texas did it. Not in the sense that, I'm surprised that Texas would do this strategically, like we were just talking about. In my purview, I think it makes sense for a program, especially the competitive ones like Texas. But just the fact that like Texas loves football and like it is a religion in that state, football, especially college football. And so for them to like kind of like remove that option, I was like, oh, it's very interesting. But we'll have to see who else cancels in the next couple coming weeks.
Yeah, look, if I'm Texas, I would just have Matthew McConaughey like do an open mic night
All
for their
right, all
spring
right,
game.
all
It's like
right.
we got the players here, and we just want to say hi to everybody. Just take a collective deep breath. Yeah, exactly. Just have them do that. And there's your spring game.
Exactly,
Like
right.
have them run through some tires, maybe like hit a couple of sleds, and that's all you really need.
You can brand a few cows, you know what I mean? We get the whole Texas thing down. You maybe have a
Get
rodeo instead.
Bevo.
Just
Yeah.
have a rodeo with Bevo. Well, the overlords of college football, the commissioners from the SEC and the Big Ten met this week in New Orleans to discuss their diabolical plans for college football. Jokes aside, Tony Petitti from the Big Ten and Commissioner Greg Sankey from the SEC are meeting for the second time in 4 months in New Orleans this week. The SEC and the Big Ten are pushing for straight seeding when it comes to the college football playoff in 2025, and conversations over future expansion from to 14 or 16 teams have actually ramped up, with talks, if expansion occurs, to having 4 auto bids for each conference. What are your initial thoughts, Rudy, on this meeting of the minds?
I don't know what your editing perspective looks like, so I'll just do it myself. This is my thought about that. Like, guys, it was 1 year of the expanded playoff so far, and what we learned is that there's realistically 8 teams that may deserve to be in a playoff, and out of that, there was still 2 teams that kind of got hot towards the end of the season to make that run. And we also learned that those big power leagues mean nothing because the
Yeah.
fact that Notre Dame played the schedule that they did, and that the first round bye means precisely nothing. No, there's no need for automatic bids for each of those conferences because as we've learned last year, and we've learned over the course of the previous playoff era of college football, the preseason rankings mean nothing. So having your entire conference ranked your 12 teams or 16 teams in your conference and taking half of them in the top 25, you're getting auto bids already the way that the system is laid out. So all they're trying to do is just make it even more like lack of competition, I guess, for a better word. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's collusion.
we called that stacking the deck. You
Yeah.
know, it, it's a very simple thing. A little sus for me. A little sus that these two are meeting, and it's the second time in 4 months, and they're discussing the partnership between their two conferences, not the rest. I know as an ACC school, and from an ACC perspective, it can look like, oh, you're keeping us out. But I always, like you just used a very key word, colluding. It's always a little sus when people are left out, and especially when the two biggest players are the only ones allowed in. There was also discussion of expanding the SEC schedule to 9 games. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think the SEC should be playing 9 games? Because I think the Big Ten actually plays 9 games.
Yeah, I look the way just like we talked about with the whole Notre Dame scenario. If they want to add an extra conference game, be my guest. It's going to allow other conferences to get in to have more availability in the playoff. I just I just want to get over this whole like circle jerk that they're having because yeah, we are ACC guys like on the outside looking in, but at the same time, we can also openly admit and say the ACC sucks as a conference. So
Oh
we're
yeah.
not worried about it. Oh, but we don't want the ACC to have a seat at the table because they're a joke. They will only make it more justifiable for them to not have a seat at the table. It's just a matter of they shouldn't have two conferences talking to each other without everybody else at the table anyway. Don't give the ACC a seat. It's just have every at this point, this is where the programs themselves need to be communicating more than the conference commissioners do. This is where guys like Dan Radakovich from Miami, or whoever the Alabama athletic director is, or Pete Bavacqua of Notre Dame, they should be talking. If the college football playoff needs to step in and say make a board of governors kind of thing for college football, I'd rather have that conversation at that level than having the conference commissioners do it. They're only doing it that way because they're the ones that have the rights to the media negotiations. So that's why they're specifically having these conversations and why they're talking about adding a ninth game. And then the reason why they want to add the ninth SEC game is because that's where the 4 auto bids come in, because they're just going to keep
Right.
cannibalizing each other. So
Of
they want to
course.
say, all right, well, we'll minimize the damage a little bit by having these automatic bids. But look, if I'm ESPN, I'd start sweating a little bit, because you do have a lot of college football under one umbrella, but you're starting to create the conditions of major schisms.
Well, I think from the perspective of ESPN, this would actually be great for them because it's an extra SEC game that they could kind of promote and send out. Interesting fact: the SEC and the ACC are the two only Power Four conferences that do not play 9 games. Both the Big 12 and the Big 10 both play 9 games. I'm all for it. I think if we're really going to get into like the scheduling thing, which we could talk about in a future how to fix college football, is you eliminate FCS, you eliminate G5, sorry G5, and then each team gets what, three, I think 3 or 4 non-conference games, right? If you go to
Mhm.
9, you have 3, right? And you make one of them from each conference. So the 3 open teams you have, everyone plays 9, and then your 3 extra games, you do one from the Big 10, one from the SEC, and one from the ACC if you're in the Big 12, and vice versa for each conference. I think that's just kind of where we have to go. If I'm Jim Phillips from the ACC, or is it Tony York? What's his name? I forgot what the commissioner from the Big 12 is. If I was them, that's how I would propose it. I would say, okay, guys, we will concede. We will give you your 4 bids each, because this is their last year of power. Moving forward next year, which I can also talk about right now. Moving forward in 2026, it's written in the CFP bylaws that the SEC and the Big Ten will have almost exclusive control over the CFP moving forward. It's written in more legalese than that, but if I'm dumbing it down, that's basically what it is. Basically, they'll be pushing the Big 12 and the ACC out in terms of voting rights and requests to change. So if I'm Phillips or I'm York from the Big 12, I'm saying, okay, listen, I'll concede to expanding it in 2026. I'll concede to you know, your 9 games, but scheduling forward, every year we all play each other and we go from there. And I think that makes the most sense at the end of the day.
That would make sense. I agree with you there. I mean, the way I would look at it is also from like a homer's perspective is Miami should have stopped caring about what the ACC does a long time ago, and they have to start looking out for themselves. Because at the end of the day, like, you could talk all about this breakdown. You could talk about how it's structured. You could talk about how they're going to realign things, but if you don't win, it doesn't matter. You
Yeah.
got to get in the playoff and you got to win. If you win the whole thing, you end up getting a seat at the table at some point in time. Because if you could turn it around and make it where you play in the title game, then you go back in the playoff the next year, and then you play for the title game again, then you get a seat at the table because now you're a constant player. So for Miami, all this back and forth, all it is lip service until they start winning games.
Another thing they discussed at these meetings is straight seeding. So no longer do conference champions get the automatic bid and the first bye. It would go straight by rankings. Good thing or bad thing? How do you feel about that?
I'm fine with that. I didn't like the whole politicking last year of like saying Boise State gets an automatic bid because they won the conference, but they're actually like ninth in the college football playoff ranking. Like, I think we all saw the handwriting on the wall on that kind of situation, to be like, no, we know they're not playing the same level of competition week in and week out. So I don't know. There's always like this argument to be made because they played like Oregon really close at one point in the year, and then you saw what happened when they when they played anybody of merit. So
Yeah.
I'm fine with that.
Yeah, I'm kind of torn between it because, it's kind of been discussed in college football with all the pundits this week and last a little bit late last week, where it's like we're on this precipice, right? Everyone keeps talking about we're on this fork in the road for college football, and it's like, yeah, does expansion is expansion good for college football? It's like, kind of, but it's also detrimental. And so, like, I see, like, yes, I see straight seating as something semi beneficial, but I also see it in the sense where it's like, man, it's like, well, I mean, if you have an ACC team or a Big 12 team that is lower in the ranks, I mean, they're going to be down at 12 or 13 or 14, you know what I mean? And yes, maybe the crappy teams deserve to be that low, but just like you use this very specific word of politicking, how do you quantify ranking, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we've seen it every year, year in and year out. This year, the most egregious, I think, this past year, but with like 7 of the top 10 teams being from the SEC, you know what I mean? You're not leaving yourself a lot of leeway for schools from the Big 12 or the ACC to get in. So this is where I mean, not to bring politics or whatever, but like this college football version of DEI, I think it is kind of beneficial. You know what I mean? Where you can get a team like an SMU. I mean, granted, yes, I know it's kind of a bad example because they played the worst and they had the lowest rankings, but a team that I think otherwise could have possibly been left out because they lost to Clemson. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
I think the theory of like, in theory, straight seating is great, but because we have this like loaded deck that is the rankings, it makes it makes it weighted when it shouldn't be. Like, yeah, if it goes to straight seating, you're going to see one will be a Big 10 team, two will be an SEC team, three will be an SEC team, four will be a Big 10 team, and they're always
Yeah,
going to do it that way in whatever permutation combination you want to leave for it. But
I 100% agree.
the way it should work in theory is that you should have a major conference champion being those one through four, one through four. And look, if you happen to have an independent Notre Dame that actually plays a really tough schedule and they go undefeated, then yeah, they have the right to be one of those four seeds as well. What I'm wondering though is how many teams want that now after they saw what happened in terms of getting a bye in the first round. None of the teams with a bye made it. Do they want to be there? Do they have the right to refuse a first round bye if
Right.
they're seeded one through four? They say, no, we actually want to play. We want to take the home field advantage.
And
I don't know.
my whole issue with this whole turning college football into the NFL is they're while yes, they're the same sport, they're completely different entities and they have a completely different biology to them. They both there's it's just different and the biggest point I was want to hark on right now is this ranking, right? So in the NFL, it's just your record, right? Your record says what you are and you are what your record is, and that's how you're seated. We're not doing that in college football. We use a ranking system that's very subjective. It's not objective at all. And so you're trying to take these NFL systems, but keeping this stuff from the old college football days. And it's literally trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. And I just don't see how you do that. I don't see how you square that circle because you've got to pick. Do you want to be the NFL? Okay, well, if you want to be the NFL, then we do away with rankings completely, and you just go by your record, and we create these divisions, and we get rid of conferences in general because there's no such like there are conferences in college football, but in the way they're structured in college football, it's just by name. They're not the same. You know what I mean?
Yep.
And so it's like we have to decide what do we want to be, right? It's like anything else in life. You got to pick. You either got to poop
Yeah.
or get off
Well,
the toilet. And so it's like,
I mean,
what do we want to be? Do we want to be college football or do we want to be the NFL? And if whichever one we are, we need to commit to that. But we're trying to play this thing where we're riding the fence and we're trying to keep both sides on. I'm like, it's not working out, guys. And you've got people who are getting kind of disillusioned to the sport and saying, this is a little weird and not my thing, you know?
yeah. Well, look at the educational rankings for some of these schools that are making the decision. Of course, they're trying to put a square peg and put it in a round hole. Just look at the teams involved. Like you're not talking about working with the brightest and the best here. Did they know their football? Sort of, but they don't know much of anything else. So Yeah, I agree with you there. I think like if you look at the NFL, for example, they also break it down across 4 team divisions. There's also significantly less teams in the NFL
Yeah.
versus college football. So like, yeah, there's a lot that doesn't work when you try to establish all these different models and make something else materialize out of it. I think the idea of like going with the older ranking systems, again, it's in theory was a great idea, but when you have this committee that have a bunch of faces that you don't know who also don't really know football themselves, and it's the strength
And
of
are
the brand,
constantly
like, oh,
being changed out every couple of years, so there's no, like, continuity, you know?
the goalposts just constantly change. Like
Yeah.
what got a team in the year before doesn't mean anything the year afterwards. Who knows what happens with this year's playoff? It could be, oh, well, we really like that they use these color shoelaces, so they're going to get into this game versus these guys who might have had one loss on their record, but they had the toughest strength of schedule. But oh, this is a flash in the pan year for them. They had a great run, but like we don't see them doing anything in the playoffs. I don't know. It is hard from a program that has been on the outside looking in for quite a long time that historically used to really overcome a lot of like the odds being stacked against them. So it pains us to talk about this kind of stuff because
Yeah.
you're trying to apply sense to something that makes no sense.
There yeah. Again, it's squaring a circle that's just it feels impossible because it's just at the end of the day, it's about money for a lot of these people, for the decision makers, it's money, and that's not beneficial for the sport. But you were highlighting, the NFL has fewer teams, and I was actually thinking about this. I think the NFL has 36 teams, somewhere in the 30s,
Something like
32
that.
teams, something like that. Between the Big 10 and the SEC, I think there's about approximately 38 or 39 teams. So how long before the two break off and start their own league?
Yeah, that's where kind of the rumors have been going for the past. We talked about it the beginning of last season too, about that might be the move that they're trying to do at one point in time. But at the same time, look, there's other teams that can contend with them. There are teams in those conferences that can't hold a candle to the other programs that are out there. So it's like, are they going to restructure and jettison some of their bottom feeders in terms of going after this whole Super League format? Possibly, but like, I'm sorry if they're going to swap teams out. Like, Bendy's not making it into a Super League. Just to be honest with you, they're not going to do
Well,
it.
no, of course, but I mean, at the end of the day, you need, I mean, you need a Cleveland Browns. I mean, sorry, Dolphins fans, you need a Miami Dolphins. You know what I mean? There are bottom feeders in the NFL too, and there are organizations, New York Giants, who don't know how to get their things together and win, except for when Eli Manning was their quarterback. So it's one of those things where it seems crazy now, but the more you think about it, the more you kind of sift through the weeds. You're like, this actually is frightfully closer than I think we want to admit. And my worry is if the ACC and the Big 12 aren't with this and they don't bend the knee, I just think it's a very easy thing to say. They'll be like, okay, peace out. Like, we're out of here. ESPN, if you want our football, cool. We're not playing any other schools from any things. We're gonna have our own little playoff at the very end, and it is what it is. Like, you can take it or leave it. And if they're still continuing to hold that big chip that they have of dominance, both the SEC and the Big Ten, who how is the ACC supposed to compete? And that leads me to my next question. How does this meeting of these two impact the ACC and the Big 12?
I mean, it impacts it tremendously, but it's another one of those scenarios where it's like the member institutions have to hold the commissioner's feet to the fire, right? Like the Big 12 is trying to make all these moves because they saw how the Pac 12 imploded and they're trying to do all these things to jockey. I feel like the onus is more on the ACC than anything else because they're the ones that had open rebellion and mutiny
Yeah.
among their member conferences. And it's been no secret just how awful that league has been run for the past 20 plus years. So I think it's a bigger indictment on them because they have these big brands in college football that can make their life in a larger conference that are really the lifeblood of what they're doing. I mean, this all started, let's go historically. This all started as ACC was a basketball conference who invited Florida State to get a football reputation. And then after about 10 years, Florida State invited Miami and Virginia Tech who had a football pedigree. And then Clemson got their act together and became one of the homegrowns on the inside. So
Yeah.
like you're talking about what should be in theory a pretty top heavy 4 or 5 heavy college football conference just being an absolute joke because they never increased their quality of competition and their officiating. And they had a commissioner that was more interested in like lining his kids' pockets with media deals and actually going out and getting real legitimate media partners for
Yeah.
their broadcast rights. So um, I think it's just again, I'll parrot this again. I think if you're at some of these institutions, like yeah, maybe Clemson and Florida State are going to settle and stick around for a couple more years until their grant of rights is over. But you got to look out for yourself. You have to get as creative as you can in terms of marketing your brand to not be left behind. That's what you have to do. I know we'll probably talk about it in a little bit. Miami's got some things that work in its favor. No thanks to Miami doing anything to benefit. It just happens to be that you have very influential people who love your program. So I think there needs to be more of that.
Yeah. I genuinely worry just because I feel like the writing, it's on the wall. And I'm not trying to put so much leverage on FSU and Clemson leaving, but I do think it will be a cascading decision, because it just won't be those two leaving. You'll see UNC, you'll see Miami. Those programs will leave to go to the Big Ten or the SEC, and that will in turn destroy the ACC and the Big 12. And so I think it's a matter also of not only the ACC marketing itself, getting teams up to par. I think it's also about making within the conference, making it more alluring to stay. So the whole like in unequal distribution, I'm for that. It's the pay for play. If you're winning your league, like look at the like what the Big 12, the Big 10 was doing with like what we were talking about with Wisconsin and locking their players in for 2 years for NIL. ACC should be doing the exact opposite. Listen, we're going to give you full control of your NIL. We're going to allow you to, not only are we going to give you full control, we're going to give you resources to invest that money that will make you triple by the time you graduate. Like you create atmospheres like that, and people will want to come because, as crazy as this sounds, right? I'm not saying this would ever happen, but if it did happen, I think it would change. But let's say the ACC does move to an unequal revenues like structure, right? And then let's say their negotiations with ESPN come up in 2031, right? Well, if ESPN says, "Hey, we're going to kick your stuff up because obviously we're seeing Florida State's going to stay. Miami's been great. Florida State came back. SMU's been killing it. The SEC's kind of been in decline. We're going to pay you just as much as the SEC." You don't think Georgia or an Alabama is going to see the ACC and go, we can go play in that league, get absolutely a minimum of 10 wins. And on top of that, because we get those 10 wins, we're going to get 10, 15 million more than what we would have in the SEC. There's no commissioner and there's no athletic director who's going to say no to that. You know what I mean?
Well, this was part of that. This was part of that narrative we've been saying too. Like in these super leagues, not everyone has a winning record. The majority of them have 500 or lower. So, in terms of how it benefits you to be there, you better be winning every single year because if you don't, it's a long slide to the bottom that you may not climb out of for decades to come. So, in terms of
Alabama.
that model, exactly. We'll see what this year looks like and what does that look like down the road because let's say they don't get any better and they can Caleb DeBoer. Where do they go from there?
Yeah.
Who's the next coach? Do they turn it around? It's going to be that exact same cycle that they had from when they had like what was it, Mike Shula
Yeah, I mean,
in
I
those
can't
days.
honestly let's go through some of these power programs in the SEC because everyone looks at the SEC as like this gold standard. And yes, for the last decade, it has been in terms of competition and talent on the field. I get that. But just like dynasties and empires, nothing lasts forever. And so revisionist history will tell you that the SEC's always been dominant, but no, every one of these stellar programs has had a lull of mediocrity. Georgia had it before Kirby got there. Florida had it for forever, even between Spurrier and whoever they had at Zook and then whoever they had after him. Like, it's not like these programs were on top forever. And you see it now, even with Kirby right now, hasn't won a national championship in 2 years. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Or longer. None of these programs are destined to stay there. And now we didn't have the transfer portal, we didn't have NIL. You've got two major mechanisms in the sport that will drastically and have drastically shift the landscape. And so to me, it's like, if we're going to sit there again, 2031, it sounds like it's far, but it's right around the corner in
Yep.
the sense of all these deals. It sounds crazy, but if the ACC got their S together and figured things out, and we're like, hey, how do we lure these other programs that, are have a winning pedigree, but are kind of slipping a little bit, bring them over to us? Because that's the thing. The SEC didn't like cower and go, oh, I don't know if we can get Oklahoma and Texas. They were like, no, let's go get them. Let's go get them. Sure.
Yeah, I mean that's a leadership thing, right? Like the SEC does a great job of pounding their chest, and they believe their S don't stink.
Yeah.
That's just what it is. They believe that. You don't have competence in Charlotte, North Carolina. You didn't have competence when it was in Greensboro, North Carolina. You just don't have that same level of understanding. Like, hey, we need to make sure our officiating is top notch so we can foster, high level competition, and we have to make sure that our programs are being looked at in the same light. So while the SEC is always saying it means more and that we're better than everybody else, you don't have that coming from a conference commissioner out of the ACC. They don't think of themselves. They might say, yeah, well, we have some top-notch competition. No, no, no. You have to openly, you have to make this kind of a show. Like to take
Yeah.
a piece out of like Miami's old playbook. We don't expect them to go Hollywood like Miami did, but like you need to support your institutions and put yourself out on a limb a little bit. And you have to make some noise and say, you can compete with them. They don't want anybody to do that, but when push comes to shove, we're just as good, regardless of whether it's true or not. You have to drink your own Kool-Aid in terms of doing that, whether you're an
Or
athletic director or a conference commissioner.
or let's just use the word you use, institution. These are no longer institutions, they're brands, and that's how you have to approach them. That's how the SEC approaches this. You're an idiot if you just think that Sankey is over there and you're just like, well, I've got Bama and I've got Georgia and Tennessee, and you know what, they're just going to keep winning games. No, they are marketing, they are branding, they are allowing those athletic directors and departments to run with it and to promote their programs and to promote that brand and to solidify that brand recognition throughout the United States, so that when people see that G or when people see that script A, they know exactly what that is. There's no guessing. You know exactly what that is. And the ACC needs to get with that. The ACC needs to figure out, like, I mean, we just saw it in Captain America, right? You've got I mean, he's kind of a tier 3 character, but whatever. But the shot is great. The shot is great where you've got Falcon and Isaiah, talking in this training sequence, and then you've got bam, the U logo right there. I mean, you can't, that's again, we call this in PR earned media. You know what I mean? Like you can't pay for that, and it's invaluable, to be in one of the biggest, cinematic universes and IPs in the history of art.
Here's the thing, you can pay for it, but it costs a lot of money. So the fact that they got that earned media, it's easy to quantify what that looks like. You literally can you can literally put a dollar amount and say, if we paid Marvel Studios to do this, if we paid Disney to do this, it would have cost us X amount of millions of dollars. Are you telling us that we're not a major brand? That some actor said, just what he said in his interviews when he came out and said, when my family moved to South Florida and I was young, like the superheroes that I knew were the 2001 Miami Hurricanes. Like those were
Yeah.
my superheroes from a representation standpoint. So the fact that you could say that, and the fact that you had people who want to put your brand in their franchise, in their creative works for free, Bama's not doing that. Georgia's
Like,
not doing that. Michigan's not doing that.
the fact that the ACC hasn't given Billy Corben tens of millions of dollars to create like a Last Chance U documentary series for like is mind-boggling to me. Like, one of the most successful documentaries, period, full stop, ever, is the U.
Yep.
So great that it kicked off a 30 for 30 thing. Then it, on top of that, garnered a part two. All of his documentaries are blockbuster. It's like this, he's an alumnus. Like, it's it's like, why are we not doing this?
It's almost like
Why
it writes
is
itself, right?
it does, right? And I'm just like, I need someone in Charlotte to, like, wake up, you know? Do whatever sort of narcotics or substances they need to do to get their blood flowing and their mind rolling, because there are brands and there are things. I mean, even Florida State, you could go into like the do something on Florida State and the chop and how Atlanta stole it and then the Chiefs stole it. And now that you see it all over the NFL because the Chiefs are dominating, they wouldn't have had that if it wasn't for FSU. I don't even like FSU, but like for God's sakes, you have brands and you
Yep.
need to exploit them. And not only that, but you have one of the most famous college football coaches right now who isn't even at one of your schools, but went to one of your schools. And there's constant rumors of him returning to that school and Deion Sanders. And it's like, why are we not exploiting that? Like, it's again, you have Bill Belichick at UNC. There needs to be, what's the NFL? I'm sorry, Hard Knocks. Why is there
Mhm.
not an ACC Hard Knocks? I mean, you have personalities here. Dabo is great in the locker room. Like, it's not like, you know what I mean? Like, I'm just like, why are we not pushing these things? And then not only that, but it's in ESPN's best interest to keep the ACC alive because they're getting the ACC for pennies on the dollar. And because of that, they should be, ugh, the more people want to watch the ACC, great. And here's the best part is if you get viewership on the SEC, again, high tide raises all ships.
Yeah. No, this is the stuff that it's infuriating when
Yeah.
you're on the outside and you can see all of this stuff happening to say like all they have to do is go to a different sports convention, meet some of these people who have done it across all of these other properties. I mean, what Formula One has done with how they,
Yeah.
document their piece, how they create their content, how they do all these events together. Like, how you can make media days like a major production to do things. Like, there's so many different avenues that you can explore, and like you talked about all these different storylines across your programs that, frankly, I hate to tell you this, but they don't know. Like if you go into that league
Sad.
office and you start
So sad.
asking people like what made Florida State famous, like they don't know. They know the war chant. They couldn't tell you half the people who went there. Couldn't tell you half the people who played there. You walk into their athletic department, like, look, some of these third party companies, like I've picked on legends and I'll do it again today. So count that in your drinking game. If oh look, every time Rudy Dogs legends take a shot, you're gonna not drive tonight. Go get your Uber, get your Lyft. But they're in charge of getting these like major sponsors. So if you're the athletic director, if you're the president, if you're the chancellor of these universities, go back to that company and say, look at all of this earned media that we got because an actor happens to like us. You're telling us we can get a couple tens of $1 million ad placement in a movie, and you can't get us a sponsor that wants to do something for the same amount or in the ballpark. Sounds like you need
Absolutely.
to find a new company to work with, or that company needs to change their personnel a bit and get people who are competent. Because look, as much as I don't like Florida State either, there's no reason why they can't find a major sponsor. Like they're look at all the stuff they're doing right now from a capital works perspective, right? Like they don't have the revenue stream for ticket sales right now because remember, they're in Tallahassee. There's nothing to do on a Saturday night. So everyone's going to go to Woke Campbell Stadium to go watch their football team play. They can't even fill that right now, not because the team is bad, but because it's under this major renovation
Construction.
project. So it's
Yeah.
right. So the capacity is like 35% what it should be. So they're losing money there, but they can't get a sponsor to come in and help. So they're doing all these things. Uh, they need to find some better partners. And as someone who, look, I think college football in Miami is better with a strong Florida State. So if we have to exchange
100%.
wins every couple of years and trash talk, so be it. But I don't want them to go into obscurity, and that's kind of where they're going
No.
right now.
Listen, there's no one. I love that. To me, the greatest rivalry, not Florida, Miami. It is FSU Miami. And I believe I
Yep.
grew up with that. I mean, we grew up with that. Like there was not whoever won that game, there was a probably a solid 12 years where I would say like 6 out of those 12 years, at least half those years, the winner
Yep.
of that game went to the national championship or won it.
Yeah.
Like it's wild. And so yeah, there's nothing more that I want than college game day, either here or at Doak Campbell, for that game. I mean, it really. I think it's a necessity, and I think it's something that the ACC kind of needs to wake up to, you know? But, I heard Miami-Dade police about to break down your door, Rudy. So we have another one in the books. I'm going to let you go. Thank you all for watching. Until next week, be good, y'all. Win the weekend. And as always, go Canes.
I think that was UMPD. I might have said too much trash about them, but yeah, I'll go deal with that. Go Canes,
I'll bail
baby.
you out. I'll bail you out, Rudy. Be good, brother.
Appreciate it. Ruiz's money's not going to help.